Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. In an earlier podcast called Unimproving, we examined a universal problem in living well, the problem of self-esteem and the feeling that we're just not good enough. In other words, that we need improving. This is arguably our biggest barrier to a meaningful happiness. And in that podcast, we saw that focusing too much on self actually makes us unhappier. So now I want to suggest what may seem to contradict that advice, that we ought to focus on self, though specifically on self-compassion. And in fact, many people resist this idea of self-compassion, thinking it implies self-pity or indulgence or self-centeredness, even selfishness. For people with a harsh inner critic, this kindly self-awareness feels wrong, even threatening. For some, it even evokes shame due to past traumas. Some people may feel undeserving of self-compassion, and it may compete with the view that self-compassion is weak or can lead to a slippery slope of being too forgiving of ourselves. And in fact, as the contrary argument runs, we ought to engage in toughening ourselves, or as we say in Australia, we should harden up and take a teaspoon of cement. Now, in the context of counselling, this resistance to self-compassion is a very common occurrence. Take the person who is depressed. Typically, they engage in really harsh self-criticism. And I've had more than one person tell me, "I hate myself," or words to that effect. And I've watched them physically wince when I've made a really honest, positive observation about them. They clearly think I'm either being nice, i.e. I'm lying, or I lack insight into their real nature, especially if they've acted in ways they're ashamed of, or if they feel they've failed in important domains of their life. Anyway, they tend to experience the idea of self-compassion as wrong for them and utterly foreign, as they don't believe they deserve it. And I don't think you have to have depression per se to have the flavour of this experience yourself. So, how should we understand the practice and effect of self-compassion in such a way that it doesn't make us feel self-pitying or selfish? Well, firstly, a primary function of self-compassion is to reduce the worst of destructive self-criticism and self-concern. It begins by understanding that we're flawed just like everyone else. We share a common humanity, and this includes a mistaken tendency to think we're somehow different to others. And then we ruminate on those alleged differences, cutting ourselves off from others, sinking deeper and deeper into self-criticism. Accordingly, a central dimension of self-compassion is understanding we deserve compassion just like everyone else. One important consequence of reducing self-criticism and self-worry using the balm of self-compassion is that we then tend to forget self and become more open and more outward focused. And this can also lead to an important insight that our preoccupation with the shortcomings of ourself is, to a large extent, the problem. Now, does this mean we jettison self-accountability and responsibility entirely? Well, clearly not. But it does mean reconceptualizing what we mean by self. And perhaps some Buddhist psychology can help here. Anatta in Buddhist thought is a teaching about not self. Now, it's not about there not being a self in the common sense view. It's a strategy for not getting caught up in a sense of self as separate, different and fixed. It's also not an argument for no self, as it's frequently misunderstood, but for a radically different notion of self, as a thoroughly interconnected being embodied and engaged in the world. And this is highly concordant with contemporary neuroscience, which consistently fails to find, a modular separate seat of self in the brain, but rather speaks of highly interconnected brain and body processes. So, I think it's safe to say there's no neural basis for a self which runs the show, so to speak. And in actual fact, the Buddha typically refused to answer the philosophical question of whether we have a self. He just thought it wasn't a question that helped towards liberation from suffering. He was nothing if not a practical man. Now, obviously, people exist as living beings and their suffering also exists. But a big part of our suffering is that we believe that our self, our core, is not worthy or it needs some significant improvement to warrant love and esteem from others, and by implication, love from oneself. So self-compassion helps reduce this obsession with self, this pervasive self-concern that can torment us for the entirety of our lives. Fortunately, the evidence for the benefits of self-compassion is really strong. Self-compassion improves personal initiative, our coping skills, and goal achievement. It lifts life satisfaction. It lifts our emotional intelligence and our sense of social connection. It promotes curiosity, happiness, optimism, and generally positive emotions. In fact, research into self-compassion has shown that when we reduce negative self-judgment, it doesn't create egoism, but rather creates increased compassion for others. It appears that self-compassionate people tend to recognise that imperfection and failure are just unavoidable. And so they're more likely to be kind to themselves and others when confronted with negative experiences. In terms of effectiveness, this absence of self-consciousness also enables them to enter into the state of flow more often, their mind being undistracted and undivided. So, somewhat counterintuitively, practicing self-compassion can really help us to stop obsessing about ourselves. And in the next part of this series, we'll look at how we might go about that in practice. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. And if you like the podcast, share it with people you like so they can like it too.